All right, now it's time to jump into today's episode. And today I'm going to be talking about late season vineyard management, which is specifically for the phenological period between harvest and dormancy, or whenever the ground freezes, depending on where you live and where your vineyard's planted. So the three areas of vineyard management that I'm going to cover for this time in your vineyard are compost application and nutrition, vineyard floor management, and preparing for any dormant season sprays that you might be doing between leaf drop and bud burst next season. So let's start by talking about compost application and nutrition. Almost 25 years into my viticulture career, I'm still continually surprised at the misinformation or misunderstanding surrounding compost related to both what qualifies as compost and realistically what it can and cannot help with in your vineyard. So let's talk about this. Let's talk for a minute about post-harvest fertilization and proper application and timing during this period of the season. So if you're not using compost as your fertilizer of choice, or if after listening to my prior statements, you realize you really don't need compost, but maybe what you need is a little bit of magnesium in your vineyard, or a little bit of boron in your vineyard, or maybe you're just low in calcium or potassium. Highly mobile nutrients this time in the season may still have a chance for uptake if you apply them immediately after harvest. And I will say, some regions harvest their fruit almost immediately before the first fall freeze and leaves drop. And in that case, there's really not a window of opportunity for uptake of nutrients. Whereas in warmer climates, where you have an earlier harvest and an extended leaf activity time after harvest, let's say 3 to 4 weeks or more, I find that in those scenarios, it's oftentimes effective to apply certain highly mobile nutrients immediately after harvest. So if you have that 3 or 4 week window of leaf activity after harvest, you could apply some highly mobile nutrients to your vineyard, either as a foliar in some cases, or through the ground, or drip application through your irrigation of something like nitrogen or magnesium or boron. Those are the 3 most common nutrients I'm typically recommending after harvest when I have that window of opportunity with good leaf activity. Now, if your vineyard reports from either soil or plant tissue test, visual observations are showing that you have low availability of some of the lower mobile nutrients, those would include things like potassium, calcium, phosphorus, and some of the micronutrients that take a little bit more time to work their way into the soil, like zinc or copper or iron, you can incorporate these types of fertilizers in the fall. And oftentimes it's useful if you're doing some cultivation to apply them and cultivate them into the soil, or at least cultivate them in a strip next to your vine row. And that essentially gets the slower, less mobile nutrient. So a nutrient that doesn't move through the soil with the mass flow of water and rainwater. That means if you have a little winter rain, that will help slowly move that nutrient down into the root zone. So when you get to bud burst, it's going to be more available for uptake. That also means that if you have winter snow, that winter snow will melt in the spring and help further push that nutrient down into the soil so it's available near the time of bud break and as you get through bloom, because that period of bloom is the highest demand time for nutrient uptake. So we want to make sure our nutrients are at the root interface when we get to bloom. And so again, there's highly mobile nutrients that move in the mass flow of water. That's nitrogen, magnesium, and boron. And then there are slower moving nutrients, especially calcium and phosphorus, very, very slow. So we like to put those out in the fall if we need to make an addition for the following season. So I just wanted to bring those up because those are some really common nutrients that fall low in many of the regions that I work with. Depending on where you are in the world, you're probably growing some kind of cover crop, either a permanent grass or cover crop between the vine rows that you're going to maintain and keep throughout the winter to slow erosion down. And in some cases, if you're cultivating between the rows, you might be intentionally planting or no-till drilling a cover crop. And cover crops can vary from one region to the next and from multiple species to just a single monocrop of something like wheat or ryegrass or something like that. So I'm not here to try to help you figure out what the best cover crop would be for your vineyard, but I am here to remind you that you want to make sure you get those planted before the late season rains come and before you get into the winter months that are too cold for seeds to take hold. So depending on your region, I think if you've been using cover crops in the past, you probably have an idea of what to put out there. If you don't, go talk to your local extension advisors, talk to your neighbor growers, find out what takes well and what takes quickly and what is not too costly. Because remember, the bottom line still needs to be considered when we're putting out cover crops. So if you need nitrogen fixation, things like legumes and clovers can be a good choice. And if you need to break up compaction in your soil, deep-rooted wheats or radishes can sometimes be a good option. And you could choose to either mow those in the spring or crimp them. I'm really seeing a lot of good results and interesting applications of cover crop crimping that leaves a thatch in the vineyard rows between vines that then can be driven over, and sometimes in hot climates keep the soil and the temperatures in the vineyard a little cooler as we get into the hotter summer months. Now, the other area besides in between row cover crops is the I'd say more novel idea of planting cover crops directly under vine rows. And I work with some growers in regions where they grow grapes on very steep slopes. They have very poor soils in some areas of the vineyard. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to reduce the competition from weeds or grasses or whatever plants are growing directly around the trunks of the vines or in that under vine row strip, whether it's through cultivation, use of herbicide, you name it. There are a lot of things we do to reduce that competition, but once the vines are losing their leaves or they're going into dormancy even before they lose their leaves, you can plant a cover crop right underneath the row if your goal is to improve the soil and prevent erosion underneath your vine rows. So things like winter ryegrass take easily. There could be clovers that you could plant. If you have wild receding cover crops in your property, such as clover or a mixture of winter grasses that come in, you may not even need to seed anything at all. Sometimes, and I think this is the most ideal scenario, is when those grasses and clovers come in on their own from the previous season and just take over that area under the vines. Now, in the spring, remember, whatever you plant under the vines, you're going to have to deal with. So it's probably better to have a lower growing type of cover crop like a creeping red fescue or ryegrass or clover. They're all examples of low growing cover crops. And they're going to need to be either mowed back or they're going to be burned back in the spring or cultivated so that they don't become competitive with vines as they break bud.